Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be in community with all of you. It's really refreshing to be talking with people who have shared commitments. I have the book that I'm talking about, which I think you can look at, pass around. It's sort of an amazing object. So what follows is an excerpt from my longer dissertation project about the relationship between radical or formally experimental poetics and anti-imperial political practice. My talk today is going to be in 3 parts with a short orienting preface. I'm a poet, and like many of you, I've asked myself repeatedly what sort of point or actual political efficacy creative work might have in the face of the ongoing Zionist American genocidal onslaught in Palestine and Lebanon. In Western leftist discourse, perhaps via bad readings of Marx, poetry is often spoken of in salvific political overtones, and I am suspicious of this reading. What emerges from the flurry of statements that circulated in the academic and media establishments of the West in the aftermath of October 7th is a shared sense that poetry might comprise a language of the future. In Judith Butler's now infamous rebuke of the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee and Palestinian armed resistance, they write that, quote, "Poets and dreamers will imagine the way forward to nonviolent liberation. In Jewish Currents, poetry gives language to the imaginary of a liberation movement born of anti-fascist solidarity." And considering June Jordan's political engagement with Palestine, historian Amanda Joyce Hall wrote in The Funambulist that poets are, quote, "the supplier of futurity, a part of the arc of revolution," and so the list continues. At the core of these formulations is a claim echoed from the halls of the UN to protests the world over, when there were protests the world over, one that can be heard both as threat and as promise: Palestine is the future. In this dire new phase of the generations-long effort to annihilate Palestinians in toto, theorizations of the poem's ability to imagine and institute an otherwise that might one day rearrange the settler colonial order through the collective effort of a mass change of heart, smacks of a ghoulish naivete. What is at stake, then, are not questions of representation or what might constitute ethical modes of narration. The question is what material political use, if any, a poem might have despite the near obliterative catastrophe of the present. This is in part the concern of Black American multidisciplinary artist and poet Jerome Ellis's 2021 debut album and book, The Clearing, and here is the album artwork. The book opens with a series of questions that spell out the work's concerns, first among them being, what is a clearing? The clearing Ellis's book is named for acts as both noun and verb. The clearing, they write, is the act of eradicating native plants to prepare the land for potential investment, the act of eradicating native peoples to prepare the land for settlement. The clearing is also a movement towards clarity, as if to say, I'm just clearing something up. And finally, the clearing is a break in the forest where enslaved people in the antebellum American South could gather to plan escapes and revolts, dance, sing, and pray. Ellis interrogates all these clearings through a clearing of their own. Ellis is disfluent. They speak with a glottal block stutter. Long, breathless pauses punctuate their speech. In a series of poems that spiral and break across the page, Ellis orbits the question that seems to motivate their artistic practice. Quote, can stuttering, blackness, and music be practices of refusal? Today, I want to walk us through the poetry of Ellis's associative inquiry and to think with Ellis about how their readings of silence and time might open the poetical to political work. In the album/book's opening track, Loops of Retreat, Ellis both declares and performs his thesis, that blackness, disfluency, and music open time. The margins of the clearing contain the poem's only obvious time-keeping mechanism. Is that legible to you? Can you read the page? Let me zoom. How's that? Better? Okay. The margins of the clearing contain the poem's only obvious time-keeping mechanism, 6 cerulean timestamps that mark out intervals of 10 seconds. Every page of the poem corresponds to 60 seconds of playback, as if the book were the score of a musical performance. But even this gesture is a fugitive form of timekeeping. There's no time signature to clearly delineate how the passage should be read. Read in the absence of its song, the eye glosses over what consonants proliferate the page. But the book is a score. It can be accompanied by the music it represents. Let's listen to the first page now.
My thesis is that blackness Dysfluency and music are forces that open time. Opening brings possibilities. Temporal refusal, temporal escape, temporal descent. But because thesis also refers to a downbeat in music, my thesis must move, must metamorphose like music.
What's repeated on the page are largely plosive consonants, Ds, Ps, and Ts, which are formed by briefly arresting air in the mouth in order to produce sound. It's in this seeming pause, where arrested air is a form of rest, a break in narration, that the poem itself begins to perform its own critique of fluency. There are resonances here in this break with the Arabic poetic tradition. I'm thinking here of Huda Fakhreddin's wonderful essay on Et al-Adnan and the pre-Islamic Qasida, Poetry Begins at Stop, in Protean magazine, where she described the archetypical beginning of the Arabic poem as the stance upon the ruined abode. Arabic poetry begins at stop, she writes, because the poet of Arabic cannot find voice or a gateway into the poem without demanding that time stop, and in that stopping time itself becomes a place, a moment to inhabit as the poet reorients time, resets it, and launches it again into a world of his own making. And here are some of the qasida that she analyzes. In Jerome's work, the stop time of the stutter is itself a ruin, the ruin of the word, the ruin of normative language, where time collapses and the past presses in on the present, allowing for a kind of fugitive communion, as they later write, quote, a non-lineal time continuum and access to the ancestors who made freedom-making plans in clearings of their own. Only in pairing the book with its music does the clearing really open to the listener and reader, wherein we can experience what our respective trainings in reading have taught us to ignore, what possibilities begin to creep in on these pauses, where the sense that fluency itself might be a narrowing of dysfluency is cast into relief. The stutter becomes a place, a clearing, from which a parallel time might be launched. Both Fakhreddin and Ellis locate poetry in this break in time. What does it mean then when Ellis insists that the stutter opens time, opens into the possibility of refusal, escape, dissent? Ellis's silences insist on themselves. Where the stutter seems to be speech deferred, it becomes overfull in the text, mingling among descriptions of what sounds fill its silences. What he produces is an opaque silence, offering something that exceeds the seeming void of that song. In his introduction, Ellis asks, what is a clock? Is it an instrument, a body with hands and a face, a capitalist rosary? If time seems closed, that's because it's actively produced by regimes of partition and control. If fluent, normative speech polices delay, it can itself be considered a kind of timekeeping. What's kept by our modes of timekeeping as in enclosed? What's kept by our modes of timekeeping as in held? Ellis asks us to think here of temporal subjection and of the ways different subjects might be formed according to their different relationships to time. On the left, you'll see here a photo of the overseer's house at the Hampton Plantation in Maryland in the United States, photographed in 1936. On its roof, you'll see a bell tower. In the clearing's preface, Ellis writes that slave owners in the antebellum United States withheld clocks and even the knowledge of how to read them from the enslaved out of fear that they might become like free time-negotiating northern workers. In Mastered by the Clock, Time, Slavery, and Freedom in the American South, historian Mark Smith writes that timekeeping, quote, was guarded jealously by whites lest it should be used in the planning of escapes or insurrections. Instead, time was meted out via bells and horns sounded by overseers, like the bell you see here. In the center is a picture of the Akka clock tower in occupied Palestine. The clock tower was one of 7 erected throughout Palestine by the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century in an effort to incorporate the provinces of the empire into modern communication and global trade networks. These clocks kept 2 times simultaneously. Alla turca, wherein hours were measured by the movement of the sun and varied with the season, and alla frenga, the European mechanical clock timekeeping system. These alla turca clock faces were replaced when the British Mandate came to power. Palestinian artist Emily Jasser details the 2001 restoration of the Akka clock tower by Zionist settlers in her 2016 work, Notes for a Canon. The restored clock was given 4 new clock faces, one in Hebrew, the second with Arabic digits, the third with Roman digits, and the fourth with Arabic Indic numerals. The clock becomes a way for the Zionists to superimpose a historical continuity with sites that predated the establishment of the Zionist state. And finally, on the right is a portrait of English clockmaker John Harrison, whose 18th century invention of the marine chronometer enabled the calculation of longitude at sea. By comparing local solar time to the time at a known fixed reference, a navigator could determine the longitude of any place, as there's a 4-minute difference between local noon and clock noon for each degree of longitude east or west of an initial meridian. This division of the Earth into increments of minutes allowed British ships to navigate with unprecedented accuracy and coincided with the rapid and dramatic expansion of the British Empire, reorganizing the entire world into a mappable grid. If we consider catastrophe beyond the punctuated obscurantist orders of the event and expand it into a broader structure of defeat, we might say that catastrophe is a mode of temporal subjugation, the creation of the disciplined body, the national subject, and the commodity in global networks of capitalist extraction and colonial subjectivity. For the sake of time and to offend all theorists, I will quickly gloss dense critical theory. Alongside Stefano Harney and Fred Moon's theorization of logistics, figured here as a world-making settler rhythm, Ellis's poetics emerge as a critique of normative temporality itself. Logistics, the organization and movement of commodities across time and space, functions in their account as both a white science and a world-making music. It operates through a fundamental misapprehension of the world as empty, undifferentiated space available for partition into property and ownership. This emptiness can only be produced by the violent transfiguration of qualitative life into quantitative value. Logistics is an operation whose fetish for loss prevention to preserve the maximum value of a commodity is itself fueled by loss, converting qualitative life into quantitative value. Fluent speech emerges as logistics' sonic analog, participating in a shared fantasy of movement without loss, wherein all is fully legible, communicable, controllable. What then does the stutter offer, aside from a break in flow from point A to point B? Can it be considered another form of organizing time, an anti-settler mode of timekeeping? Ellis wends his way to an answer through his theory and performance of melisma. Melisma, Ellis instructs, typically refers to singing more than one note per syllable. Melisma is one of the ways that music can distend, suspend, and elongate and dilate time. If settler life is contingent on the imposition of a rhythmic time in which nothing else can be heard, what melisma and Ellis's melismatic silences teaches us is that even this silence can be tuned to our listening. The clearing figures the stutter's silence as melismatic. The absence of sound is sound's excess, a break where multiple forms of meaning can dwell. Opening time, then, is to refuse the temporal project of settler colonialism at work everywhere, an insistence that the past is past, foreclosing any opportunity to reckon with the structural and ongoing dispossession that the settler state is premised on. Black melisma, Ellis writes in the preface, becomes a place of possible, momentary, transitory, glimpsed liberation, a gem of patience in the rock face. I want to close now with an excerpt from Ellis's track and poem, Dysfluent Waters. In the minutes before this excerpt that I'll play, Ellis describes the voyage of the slave ship Castilian in the 18th century. The enslaved on board were provided musical instruments, as was common practice, to make the voyage more enjoyable for all. He narrates what followed.
Tozer and his crew are performing their normal duties on the main deck, while down below the Africans play the instruments loudly. The crew listened. As the Africans played, they used the music to muffle the sound of their breaking shackles. Several rose from the hold, attacked the crew, and injured 7 members.
Ellis's work is a poetical gesture and not a political theory. But perhaps it's in part the work of poetry to make liberation thinkable. A poem can be a clearing, a space from which to plot and sustain revolutionary energies and movements. It can make liberation's potential energy visible as a gem lodged in a rock face. It might expand the fields of discourse that make the present thinkable and actionable. Quote, once resistance becomes thinkable, speakable, nameable on its own terms, Birzeit professor and scholar of the Palestinian Revolution Abdul Jawad Omar writes, it ceases to be local, it ceases to be containable, it becomes a mantle, it becomes a question. Which is all to say that if the poem can have revolutionary potential, that potential seems to lie in part in its ability to instigate some action beyond the limits of the rhetorical. Subjectivity alone, temporal subjectivity or subjectivity constructed otherwise, will not remake the world. That remaking is the hope of the poem. Thank you.